the chat so we get to know who's here, since we don't have you all on camera. This is how we'll know how each other will know who's here today. Dr. Rogers is going to pause for questions at various times, but go ahead and ask them when they occur to you in the chat, and she will make record of them and circle back with them, so that we hopefully are able to address all your questions today. And you will be, I know this is the most popular question, we always get it, but you will be receiving a link to the slides and the recording, likely by the end of the week. So you will be getting all of that good information to have handy. So looks like we have a critical mass in here. So I don't want to delay because we have a lot of good content to share today. And welcome to all of those of you who have joined us already. My name is Anna Beltran. I'm the director of the Grandfamilies Kinship Support Network, which is the first ever federally supported technical assistance center on the families. And on the next slide, you will see kind of the umbrella of systems that we work with and we support. We do not support the families directly, but we work with systems and nonprofits. Can you move the slide row for me, please? Thank you. We do all this work in cooperation with the Administration for Community Living at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And we are available, next slide, to provide an array of assistance. Can you move to the next slide? Thank you. So we host a variety of webinars. We're essentially doing monthly webinars at this point, and there is a link there, which again, you will get these slides to all the webinars that we are hosting. They're all free of charge, as is all of our assistance. We also respond to individual requests for assistance. So if you are, say, a child welfare agency and you want to know who's got a good firewall policy for ensuring that children are placed with relatives, ask that question on that form, and Sheila Bottoms, our technical assistance specialist, will get back to you, and she has access to a number of subject matter experts in addition to 5 national partner organizations that do this work with us. So we're very blessed to have a rich array of partners and subject matter experts to help us provide all kinds of assistance to those who ask. And then we have a new website, fairly new, it's been about 6 months now, I think, that has all kinds of resources. And I'm not exaggerating when I tell you that we put new resources up there every week. So please visit it often. You'll see the URL there at the bottom of the page of that slide. So again, all of our services free of charge. And on the next slide, you'll see where, if you haven't yet, you can sign up for our monthly newsletter. We won't bother you a lot. It'll just be monthly usually, with all those resources that we've posted, all of our free webinars, and all of our free assistance. So without further ado, I am very honored and privileged to turn over this webinar to Generations United Senior Fellow, Dr. Anita Rogers, who is also a consultant to us at the Grandfamilies Kinship Support Network here at Generations United. I'm going to ask Mari, our communications person, to drop a link to her extensive bio that is available on our website in the chat. So thank you so much, Dr. Rogers, for organizing this, and I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Anna, and I said it right and not Anna. I am so pleased to be here. This webinar is very special because it really taps into a community, the African Caribbean community, that really has not been serviced that much by the Kinship Support Network. So, and with Philadelphia, the 8 grantees, 2 of the grantees are AFRICOM and Al Wasatia that were funded by the William Penn Foundation of 8. And in working and providing technical assistance to them, I really found out all the barriers and some of the entry points and some of the strategies that are needed to work with this community. And I had the opportunity to meet Dr. Eric Edie, and through Dr. Eric Edie, I met Dr. Deedat from Widener University. And they are just a working group of 2 men who know so much knowledge about this field. So thank you all for being here. So before I go on and before we start the PowerPoint, I want to tell you about these two amazing men and who are going to be presenters for today. And of course, please feel free to put your questions in the chat. And if we don't get to them through this chat, through this session, through this webinar, just keep them in the chat. They will be in the chat, and we will also respond to them later because we want everybody to have the information. So who is Dr. Deedat? Dr. Deedat is a professor at Widener University. He holds a doctoral degree in social work, and he's taught various social work courses there. But he's also really kind of entrenched in the research and the practice of working with families and children in the foster care to promote and advocate for better outcomes for that vulnerable population. So he's a unique balance of someone who's African and someone who's a researcher and someone who's been a practitioner. So we're so happy to have Dr. Deedat with us today. Dr. Edie, our second presenter, is the president and COO of AFRICOM-Philly. That's the Coalition of African and Caribbean Immigrant Communities. He's also a former lecturer in the College of Sciences, Health, and Liberal Arts at Philadelphia University. He was a Fulbright scholarship. He was ahead of Fulbright scholarship, and he attended and graduated from Temple University, my alma mater. The Coalition of African and Caribbean Communities was founded in 2001, and it's very special because it's one of the few in the country dedicated to servicing that population. And because of his advocacy work and civic engagement and collective power of organizing the community, we hope that the areas of kinship care will even blossom under his leadership and be replicated in other places. Now, before we begin, I want us to get a snapshot of who is with us today. We have a lot of participants, but we're going to have a short poll, and the poll is going to give us kind of, again, like a snapshot of who's here. For instance, Ro, could you bring up the poll, please? And we need you all to check your position or status. Agency staff specializing in serving this community, which is the African Caribbean community, and agency staff not specializing, but has served or plan to serve that community. And if you happen to be an African or Caribbean kinship care giver. So we're going to give you just like 1 minute to check those off, and then we'll get the poll back and see what the results are from Ro. So please go and check those now. Thank you so much. So I'll give you about 20 seconds more, and then Ro will give us the results of the survey. So you as participants and INTAC, the Technical Assistance Center, can get like a scan of who's participating. And it also gives us, you know, again, a small snapshot of what's going on in our community and around the country. Okay. So if you see the poll results, 76% of the people participating today are agency staff not specializing but serving this community. And we didn't have any African or Caribbean kinship caregivers, which I'm not surprised. And we'll talk to you about that later. And there's 14 who actually are specializing in that community. So thank you so much for that. Now, I'm going to turn this over to the next slide, Ro, to Dr. Edie. Dr. Edie, are you there? Dr. Edie?
I am here.
Okay, so I need you to start with this slide about the objectives and just kind of talk a little bit about what we hope to accomplish during this webinar. Thank you, Dr.
Thank you.
Okay.
Well, I want to start by welcoming all of the participants to this webinar today for this great, wonderful opportunity that we have to talk about kinship care among African and Caribbean immigrant communities in the United States. For today, we hope that at the end of this webinar, we will be able to appreciate the role and significance, of culture and norms for African and the Caribbean immigrants, identify the unique kinship care and family dynamics that frame the daily life, understand the resources that support these families, understand the cultural and the governmental barriers that may interfere with African Caribbean immigrant families, securing kinship support. And finally, hopefully we can develop an effective service model and practices for working with these families. It's a lot, but hopefully we will be able to cover as much. Next slide. And then here we want to talk about some terminology. Can we move to the next slide, please? Well, dealing with African and the Caribbean immigrants, we have sometimes we do encounter some technical terms that I want to cover in here. The first one, when you look at the census or any official document from the US administration, it will be a matter of immigrants sometimes being identified as a foreign born. And per the US Census Bureau or the American Community Survey, foreign born are identified as people who were not or are not US citizens by birth. That means all of those people who were born outside of the United States before migrating. And that even includes the people who may, by way of staying here, also may obtain naturalization. And then this poll also includes those that we call as unauthorized, for a better word, but sometimes it also goes through undocumented. It is important for us to know all this terminology because very definitely in our experience, it does interfere in the practice that we have encountering and working with immigrant families. Then there is the other term of refugee and exilee. Even though these two terms seem technically the same because of the benefits that a refugee or a person obtaining asylum status, for instance, as an exilee can have and enjoy, there is a difference between the two. The refugees are those families or those individuals who are admitted into the United States as a refugee. And the exilee or the asylum seekers or people who are granted asylum, exilee are the people who are already in the United States on their own and apply for asylum. And the application for asylum can be based on quite a number of factors. It can be based on political reasons, political fear. It can be based on religion reasons. We do have families where asylum was granted because of a female circumcision. So there is a variety of reasons, even including the Violence Against the Women Acts, let's say women who are victims of abuses. Then we have also the TPS, the Temporary Protected Status. Many of the families that we deal with benefits. The temporary protected status is a status that is temporary, humanitarian status that is granted to nationals of the country per the determination of the White House or the US CIS, which is the Custom and Immigration Services. Currently, you have a country such as Cameroon, Haiti, Sudan, South Sudan, that are benefiting from TPS, including some Liberians. Then you do have the deferred enforced departure. This status is essentially currently among the African communities for the Liberians. They were granted that under President Bush. It has been renewed every year. And then if you remember, before he left the office, President Trump turned that into the Liberian Immigration Fairness Act, which allowed many of them on TPS and DED to apply for citizenship by way of having been in this country for quite a number of years. This is also very important for us to know because it created the pathway for many of these immigrant communities that we work with to either naturalize or simply move to a permanent legal status. Those status, again, are very important because sometimes they create barriers for family to access either federally funded or state funded, or even sometimes city funded program to benefit kinship families. And then we have the Violence Against Women Act, which is a VAWA, and that one specifically protects women who have been a victim of abuse. It can be domestic abuse, it can be from their partners. So these are some of the terminologies that we wanted you to be aware of, and also understand the ways in which they interfere in the daily life of the families that we work with. Dr. Deedat, or Dr. Anita.
I'm going to turn it now over to Dr. Deedat.
Hi, Dr. Rogers, and Dr. Eddie, thank you for starting this very strongly and explaining the various different terminologies that are, that immigrants can be categorized into. So thank you. If we could go to the next slide. So who is an African? For us to understand all these concepts or all these terminologies that Dr. Eddie just provided, we need to know who is an African or who is a Caribbean. And the definitions, that everybody, we can hear people identify as African Americans or Africans. It is very important to know that there is quite a difference, right? Not just by the color or the skin color, but also the ancestry. So an African is a person born in Africa or a person who is a descendant of a native of Africa, or who can trace their ancestry to native inhabitants of Africa. At the moment, in 2023, there are 54 countries in Africa, and these are spread across 5 different regions of the continent, West, East, South, Central, and North Africa. Over 1.4 billion people currently live in Africa as of 2023. And then there are many languages, native languages, to be precise. This doesn't include English language, French, Portuguese, and the other Western languages, about 1,200 of these languages. I am from Ghana, and in Ghana alone, there are more than 49, there are precisely 49 languages, native languages in Ghana, out of which 9 of them are written or spoken in schools, right? But English language is the dominant or the official language in our school, in our curriculum, and in other places. But we need to appreciate the fact that Africa is very diverse, not only in terms of the regions, but also languages and cultures. And that's very pertinent when we have to talk about kinship care. So if you could go to the next slide, please. So now moving from Africa and going to the Caribbean, right? So a lot of us in the US take vacations. We say, we are going to the Caribbean. We are going on vacation to Latin America. So which part of the southern part of the Southern Hemisphere or the south of the US is considered Caribbean? A person that qualifies as a Caribbean has to be born in one of the 13 sovereign countries of the Caribbean region, right? And these excluding the Hispanic areas of the Caribbean, of course, Cuba, Dominican Republic, and Puerto Rico. Cuba, Dominican Republic, and Puerto Rico may be considered as Caribbean countries, but they are not specifically African less oriented, or they do not identify as Africans, to be specific. But countries like Haiti, Barbados, and other the Bahamas and many of these sovereign countries identify as Caribbean countries, or the West Indies. More than 44 million people live in the Caribbean. That was data 3 years ago or 4 years ago in 2019. And there are 6 official languages. And these are basically mostly Western languages, with the exception of the Haitian Creole and Papiamento, right? So we have Dutch, we have English, French, and the Spanish, Western languages in the Caribbean region, and many native languages. But the 2 official languages, which are native languages, are the Haitian Creole and the Papiamento. There are, as I mentioned, there are so many different native languages, depending on where you are in the Caribbean region. If you are in the Bahamas, or if you are in Haiti, you might hear different languages, native language. Or if you are in Jamaica, you might hear a different language. So there have been an influx, right, of the Caribbeans in the U.S. and Africans in the U.S. over the last few years. Immigration trends have increased significantly, which I will talk about in a few. But currently, there are 3.06 million non-Hispanic Caribbeans in this country, making them the largest Black immigrant group in the United States at the moment. But the African immigrant population in the U.S. are currently the fastest growing Black immigrant group in the U.S. I'll talk more about that on the next slide, please. So let's look at the current population of Black immigrants in the United States. 10% of Black people in the U.S. are immigrants. That means every 1 in 10, right, Black people you meet, is an immigrant, right? And nearly 9 in 10, 88% of all Black immigrants in the U.S. are from the Caribbean or Africa, So it means if you meet Black immigrants, 9 out of 10 will identify as African or Caribbean. This is a significant number, right? And this population deserves the attention, and that's why we are here today for this webinar. And as I mentioned previously, the Caribbean immigrant population in the U.S. is the largest Black immigrant group, right, in the U.S. But the African immigrant population is the fastest growing population, immigrant population in the U.S. In fact, sub-Saharan Africans are, the fast, and when I say sub-Saharan Africans, I mean Black Africans, right? Not including the northern part, which is the Arab or Maghrebian. So you're talking about Egypt, Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, and Libya. They are not even counted as part of this Black immigrant population we are talking about. But the sub-Saharan African population is the fastest growing population in the, immigrant population in the US, 52% growth between 2010 and 2018. This far outpaces the general, immigrant population in the US, which was at 12% as of 2018. So this is, it shows that the African immigrant population, or sub-Saharan African immigrant population, is growing at a very higher pace, right? And that we need services, we need opportunity to serve this population and all immigrant populations, in fact. Again, the growth of the African, sub-Saharan African Black immigrant population in the US is significant, and that attention must be drawn to this population, and kinship care is right in the culture and how Africans go about, raising their children and grandchildren. And it is very pertinent to talk about this topic today because of the population growth and the number of Black immigrants in the country. Next slide. Yeah, so what is the pattern currently? I mentioned it earlier, right? That there's a huge number of African immigrants or Caribbean immigrants in the US. But we have to also understand that most of these immigrants came here legally, right? And Dr. Edie did talk about the various categories, right, of immigrants in the country. Most of Black immigrants in the US came with a family-based visas, right? So they are here, they acquired their visas before coming to into the country. And according to a report on Black immigrants, right? 59% of Black immigrants arrived in the US through family-sponsored visas, as I mentioned earlier. And out of that, 10% arrived through the diversity visa program, which has been around for several years or for decades, right? Inviting immigrants from across the globe. But Black immigrants comprise 35% of all asylees or asylum applicants and 23% of all refugees. So we heard about that when Dr. Edie talked about the different categories of immigrants, but here is the statistic: 35% of all asylees in America are Black immigrants, and 23 of all Black immigrants, all immigrants in the country are refugees, Black refugees in the country. Yeah, so we will, as we go along, we will be looking at the various statistics and other pertinent information that informs why we need to pay attention to kinship care, because it is very central to African families and how we raise our children, or how we promote family unity and preservation. Next slide. And I will hand this over to Dr. Edie.
Thank you, Dr. Deedat. And here we go again, here to explain some of the social structures that we encounter, find, and see among African and Caribbean immigrants. The structures are different. Under what we call the family, we have encountered and we see what we call the mixed families by ethnicity and by race, which means that, we serve populations that are immigrants, either by way, again, of marriage. You have different, ethnicities, in one family setting, which will include, number one, African background, Caribbean background with Native American. Years ago, I did conduct a study and find out that whereas in the 1960s, 1970s, when African immigrants, were coming more in this country as students, there were a lot more of mixed marriages between, the Black immigrants and the white American families. You have a great change. And in cities like Philadelphia, where we are, the ratio is even bigger and larger today. So you have this mixed. You do also have among the immigrant families that, where we know immigrants from either the Caribbean or from Africa that also form those families. The other form of a mixed status that we know is, which is the most important for the work that we do, is the immigration by status. It is obvious. For instance, 2 days ago, AFRICOM did provide service to a family. The mother and grandmother of that family are, quote unquote, undocumented, unauthorized, individuals. But on the other side, they have children who, by way of being born in this country, do qualify or are eligible, for public benefits or other services that their parents, need not be allowed to have or to use. That does not prevent the parents, from applying for those benefits on behalf of those children. So you have this mixed families status. And the other point that we call the mixed family per unit, it is not impossible. In certain cities like Philadelphia, where housing is a very hard and very difficult to obtain, it is not impossible to see multiple families that living in one single unit or in multiple units, houses, for instance. Currently, with the influx of African and Caribbean immigrants that we know in the city of Philadelphia and elsewhere where they are being resettled, we see that those families actually come to live with either a relative or a friend, creating this mixed up family status. It does apply to the African immigrant, to the Caribbean immigrant, as well as the immigrant from what we know as brown communities, Latin America or South America. It is important, therefore, for us to understand these intricate, situation or structures of the families that we deal with in here. You do even have people in certain families who are on what we call, deportation. And it is important for us to mention all those elements. Why? Because again, it does interfere with access to services, with a fear, with a trust, and openness of those families, again, to have access to the services. By way of religion, it is important to identify one thing that in further slides we will talk about the role that faith-based organizations play in the lives of these families that we work with. Therefore, we find a Christian denomination, and you can split that a good division of Catholics, of evangelicals. We have seen the evangelical movement growing like a wildfire. When I first came to the United States, in 2000, we observed that there were maybe here and there 1 or 2 churches or mosques serving the African community, for instance. But today, with the population exploding, with many more people, the African Caribbean or Black immigrants, were being the fastest growing. We have also observed that those 1, 2 churches or those 1, 2, 3 mosques, now we have a blossoming, right, of those faith-based organizations. It is good. It also has its shortfalls. However, the lesson to carry in here is faith plays a huge role in the stability of those families, and it is important, of course, to understand that other faiths, exist as well. Many communities that families will work with do not identify as either Christian or Muslim, for instance. They do also have the traditional African religions and the practices that what they have even in this country as well. Can we move to the next slide? What is important also for us here to understand is this diagram in here, all right, which shows again, what the children, in U.S. Immigrant families. When you look at the chart between 1990 and 2021, which is a good, decade and census period, when you look at the share of children among from immigrant families in 1990, you have about 8 million of them. When you look at the 2021, which is certainly the outcome of the most recent census, you will find out that we talk about 18 million, so an increase of about 10%, which clearly reflects again the growth of that African and Caribbean immigrant population in the different cities where and the states where they live. And it is also important for us to note that if we take the example of the city of Philadelphia that we know very well, those are children of immigrant families essentially frequent the public school systems. This is the line of education that they have. Very few of them actually attend parochial or private schools. So public schools becomes the institution, becomes the best ally. And it is important to understand also the relationship that exists and how those parents, those families actually navigate the public school system in the different cities where they live. Can we move to the next slide? And in ending here, there is something that I want to bring to your attention, and this is more of the practicality of what we do, right? Kinship care, as we said, in the quote-unquote American way or in the Western ways, as Dr. Anita, was suggested when we were preparing this webinar, that word does not exist per se, but the linkages are in there. And it is interesting to know, for us to know and understand how those linkages are being reproduced as a modes of survival, as ways for those families, to maintain themselves once in the United States. The main form of a cross-border kinship care is what we call, an informal arrangement that can just be temporary. What does that mean in here? Somebody is going on a trip, or somebody is facing deportation. Who in the community can do that? It comes in those communities that we serve as something that you do not need actually to seek a formal letter, writing, etc., etc. This again, what kind of speaks onto the knowledge or the ignorance of what can be in place. State legislation, for instance, or federal legislation when it comes to what taking care of those children. And then it does involve, more especially, not solely sending a child from a developing, or a transition country to stay with relatives residing in another country. Yes, what happened is not even within countries. If you take the case of what we know as children exploitation, for instance, and we're going to leave the United States and look a little bit at what is happening in Africa, we have cases of child labor, for instance. We have cases of children being brought in some countries, let's say in the cocoa growing or cocoa producing countries, for instance, like Cote d'Ivoire, like Ghana, where Dr. Deedat is from, and me from the Ivory Coast. It has been noted that what children work, as a child laborer in those plantations. Where do they come from? Sometimes those children are actually brought to those countries from the neighboring countries like Burkina Faso and Mali, etc. But even within the country, that also you have extended families that can decide that a child can be actually placed with a relative who are in the city, either to go to school or also to do some work. The kind of mindset, is also kind of reproduced in and here among immigrants, not per se for children exploitation, but more so to create some sort of linkages that are necessary for them to adjust to this new environment, which can be very, very traumatic. And then there is another one that we call the informal daycare, right? When it is interesting that, when the tax season arrives, some families actually do struggle to prove that, what they are paying somebody. It can be a grandmother that they call, right? An informal grandmother in the community who, by a way of her age, does not work, okay? And is home and is taking care of not only her own biological, grandchildren, but also the children of people in the neighborhood or people in the communities, people, families that from the same country or other relatives that can be in there. These are some of the linkages that actually for us participate into this broad spectrum of what we know as kinship care among African and Caribbean immigrants. As we move to the next slide. The family patterns, we talk about kinship care in here. The family patterns, are very important in here. Cultural dynamics and cultural norms. In the family units, we are not looking necessarily at the family units the way we used to look at, either in the Caribbean countries or in the African countries. There is clearly some adjustment being made. It is not impossible to have, again, as I said earlier, multiple families living in one unit, but also extended, families living by way of visiting or coming. You've had, immigrant families, by the time they have a children, for instance, to pay for their relatives, to pay for their parents to come and help them raise those children within their own homes instead of sending them all the time to a daycare. This also kind of shifts, the family units, for instance. In terms of marriage patterns and preferences, also very important in here. Of course, you have probably heard of many stories of African immigrants, returning home to, secure a marriage, because there is this understanding that, marrying in your own culture can also produce better outcomes and better results. And parents do encourage that. But when it is not the case, we can imagine or understand already what it means for caring for children, for taking care of those children, and of course, schooling and other things. When we talk about attachment and separation and loss, here I want to insist more on the traumatic aspects of immigration. A few years ago, we as AFRICOM conducted, with the assistance of the Department of Behavioral Health and Intellectual Disability in Philadelphia, study groups among African immigrants to understand new patterns in terms of immigration and where trauma lies in. We found out that for some people, for some grandparents, for some parent periods, for some members of the communities, the question of being isolated, the question of lacking this kind of extended family or community support when it comes to looking after the children is something that can create some problem. Of course, Dr. Deedat later on will explain the interaction with the child welfare system, but it is important for us to understand again where all those things come from. The role of culture is definitely important. It is great. It is something that we cannot minimize. Parenting styles. Immigrant parents want their children to excel. When we look again, at the statistics, we look at the American Community Survey, we look at the number of years of schooling, and in terms of even degree, we see that many immigrant groups achieve higher when it comes to education. To what extent this becomes, success stories, but also to what extent this becomes also traumatic, and create a lot of conflicts between the parents and the children, which again can lead to connection with the child welfare system, and of course, intervention of the kinship families in here. And I want to go quick. The community and the cultural gathering are a best way for us to understand also how these African and Caribbean immigrants maintain title. Currently, with the spring season coming in and later the summer, there will be a lot of cultural activities. And sometimes those cultural activities consist of what? Consist of celebrating the national holidays, for instance, which are rallying point for members from the same country, immigrants from the same country, to celebrate their heritage and their culture. In Philadelphia, during Immigrant Heritage Month, for instance, you have different communities, whether they're from the Caribbean, they're from Haiti, they're from Cote d'Ivoire, do organize, their own ways of events to keep those cultural units, moving. And that is also very important in terms of getting their children also acclimated, understanding a little bit of their culture as well. I already talked about the value of education and then the views of school. I want to insist on that slide in here. When it comes to schooling, we have held quite a number of meetings with the superintendent of the school district of Philadelphia. One thing that came out clearly is that the vision of the school for the African immigrant parents is not necessarily what they are expected to have. For instance, the constant interaction and intervention, meeting with the teachers, parent-teaching conferences, for instance, is not necessarily something that people see, because that kind of engagement does not exist back home, when school is the responsibility of the teacher, the school principal and others to take care of the kids. And when they come home, the parents have to do their job. So this constant engagement sometimes is lacking, and it can also, it does, represent an area where we needed to make a lot more efforts to make the parents, immigrant parents understand. And this also comes because of what? Some barriers. The barriers can be lack of civic engagement, but it can also be the linguistic barriers that prevent many of them to be really, really open. And the other one is the immigration barriers in terms of the status. We move to the next slide. And I hope that I'm not going too fast. Dr. Anita, I'm still on that slide in here.
Yes, really discuss
Thank
this
you.
one, barriers to kinship care, and then we're going to take a break and do a poll. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So very quickly, talking about, barriers to kinship care services, some of those barriers are, the common barriers that, immigrants, Black immigrant families, encounter. The ignorance and fear of the child welfare system is one of the things. And I'm going to give you an example. It is not a kinship or a grandparent or kin family, but that was a direct family that, as soon as they arrived in this country a few years ago, by the time they have their immigration and asylum case, accepted by USCIS, have a problem with the child who was left unattended, fell, broke his arm, had some injuries to his head, and the child welfare system got into that. The point in here is the church members, right, where the family, the members of the church, where the family was worshiping, they were not aware of the fact that they had the ability and the possibility of reclaiming custody of that child while the parents were in custody. This kind of ignorance, will lead the child protective service, of course, to find and place the child in another family, creating, what the problem that we have. So that kind of ignorance really plays against us. The child abuse clearance. Many families don't understand what it means to have a child abuse clearance. It's my own child, and I know what is good for my child, right? So therefore, bypassing this regulation. Low income and under-resourced working families. This also came out in a lot of our surveys. The fact that, people, either by way of the immigration status, have to work multiple jobs, take them away from their homes, and expose also their children to some sort of, misbehaviors or opportunities for them to truancy. This is the word I was looking for. And in the absence of supervising, let's say, grandparents or kin related, families in the communities, it can also lead us to what we have. Discrimination is another one. Language barriers. Encounter with the police at an early stage. We have had the people who were placed on deportation when they were younger, even before they were able to, let's say, apply for legal permanent residency or even for naturalization. Domestic violence is getting bigger and bigger, but we want to thank authorities, municipal authorities and state authorities for the VAWA, which is the Violence Against Women Act, and many other opportunities created to allow women and even men who are victims of domestic abuse to take. But there is a clear linkage between domestic abuse, domestic violence, and kinship care. I already mentioned the fear of status, with the fear of deportation. And then another problem, barriers, is the trauma related to the transition to this new environment, which is the United States. And I want to stop in there, Dr. Anita.
Thank you. Before our next slides we're going to be talking about access points and strategies for engaging the families. But before we do that, Ro, would you put up a poll? Because we want to find out what you have been doing or what you have experienced as the barriers to the services. So, poll 2 should say, it should have several questions. Planning to expand services to these communities, yes, 2. The second question, Ro, we need all of those questions. And if not, we could just report to that one. Please, everybody respond to that in a minute. Okay. Ro, can we have the findings or the poll? So 9 said no, 80% say yes, and 20% said no. So that's good. All righty. Ro, can you bring up the second question? I'm gonna give you like a couple of seconds on that. The yes or no. Okay, and let's see what the polls say on that. 60% said yes and no, and 34% said no. The next one, reaching out to these families has been a priority. All right, everybody had that time. Let's get the poll for that. Let's see what that question is. No. Okay. And it may be no, because you might not know who's been in that community, or maybe what I found is that people have just ignored it as a group. And the next question. How many of you want to think about working collaboratively with the community agencies serving these families? Yes or no? Okay, that's easy. And let's stop. 96%. That's excellent, excellent. And the last one is just a series, so we're gonna maybe take a minute on that. Check all that apply, the greatest challenges to engaging these families, or check all that apply. Okay, I'm going to stop. And let's get the results of this poll. Okay. All right, thank you. And this information is also helpful to the National Technical Assistance Center, and because it also parallels some other immigrant populations that have some of the same barriers. All right, close. Thank you. Dr. Eddie, we need to move quickly because we need to go to Dr. Deedat on the access points. So the next slide, if you can talk about these next slides on access points and just highlight some of the things, because they're going to be getting a copy of all of this. All right.
Thank you, Dr. Anita. Very definitely, I'm going to go through it very quickly. And this is the outcome of some of experience, right? How we have conducted outreach and where we've been able to hit and where you can find those communities. The faith-based organizations I said earlier are the churches, the mosques, and others are great points because they are the greatest resources. In my experience in Philadelphia, I realized that the faith-based organizations were in and there before we formed organizations like the African Family Health Organization, like the Coalition of African Communities, like any other communities will come in there. So the faith-based organization are your number one, outreach and engagement, access points. The grassroots-based communities, not many organizations, can reach a level that AFRICOM or AFARO reach in terms of having a brick and mortar place or having, a budget and having staff. There are national organizations, right? When you search in the city or in the state where you are, among immigrants, you will see that they have that. There are organizations that are just built around, specific ethnic groups. And then you also have for African and immigrants, what soccer is a great thing, is a great opportunity. And of course, you have the community-based agencies, that serve this population. The immigrant-led agencies, but we do also work, and you wanted to be very careful, about the immigration agencies. In Philadelphia, you have the National Service Center, you have the highest, and you have many of those groups, for instance, organizations or agencies that work with the immigrant community. They are great access points as well. The translation services, some of them are set up by immigrants themselves. And then you have the educational system. Yes, they very definitely, the private schools and the after schools programs are great. But then lately, we work on business corridors. Many immigrants, create their businesses. They are micro business owners. Women are air breeders. They have a restaurant. They have ethnic grocery stores. It is a great access point as well. Social media, podcast shows, and online community. It will be great to research that. And then you have local media, right? Newsletters, cable shows, and radio shows. Of course, local and government agencies, and then the consulate and embassies. And you have those slides in here. Dr. Anita, sorry, I just wanted to
That's all right.
through that very quickly.
Okay. And the last slide, the two more slides, go to the next slide.
I want to take time even here. I should probably take time, to go over this because, culturally responsive services strategies. There are things that, I think we want the audience today to be aware of, to be aware of. Number one is to recognize that this population has been untapped, to receive kinship support. It's very, very, very key. For AFRICOM, for instance, we were very happy that we were selected because we have had experience with the families with the child welfare system. But to be honest, we were not really prepared, that we didn't have that capacity. Second thing is to conduct an environmental scan of the targeted community to identify where most African Caribbean immigrant families live. Yes, immigrant community tend to congregate, find the access point, find where they are. Identify what community agencies currently serve this population. They are your best allies. But remember again, national organizations, grassroots organizations, immigrant-led organizations, okay, are great. There is something that, we ourselves also face. It is the reluctance of kinship families to get involved with anything that is related to the system or to government. It is clear out of the discrimination that we see in the immigration services or the type of bigotry that we see in there. People have reasons, what to fear. It is important to identify that. Organizations like AFRICOM, will become your best ally as well. Identify, with them as to serve as a community liaison. It can be organization, it can also be individuals, okay? And point, of course, by respecting people's, religion is something that, all Americans, have to do. So we don't have to insist on that. But one of the things, the last point in here include in the intake information about immigration challenges and status. I'm going to caution you to be very careful about that because sometimes it is a turnoff and people completely shut up when you want to know up front about their immigration and legal status. At AFRICOM, we don't ask that question at all up front. But it comes sometimes, by itself, because when somebody comes to you and say, hey, we want to do X, Y, and Z, but we cannot access. Why is that? Because I do not qualify. It already rings the bell for us in terms of their immigration status. But our advice is do not upfront, ask this kind of question.
And the last slide for you, real quickly, Doctor, the next slide, Dr. Edie.
Recruit representatives of these communities into formal planning groups for cities, states, and federal policies. It is important. One thing that what we have done successfully at AFRICOM is to join all these civics organizations to widen our network, widen our connection. In Philadelphia, we work with a city council member, what's his name? David Ho, for instance, who has been keen on interrogating, right, best practices of the child welfare system. Incorporate information about this group into the professional development of agencies. That is clean. What is happening today is good as a training, and we hope that it can be repeated more and more. And as many other organizations do when there is a new immigration law that can impact, kinship families or families, Black immigrant families, create some tips or fact sheet that can be distributed in many and multiple languages as well. And Dr. Anita, I want to stop in there.
Thank you so much. A lot of information, and a lot of this information will be valuable because you can use this information as you do professional development for your staff. You can pull this up and use this as a template for discussion. Now it's a great pleasure to turn this over to Dr. Deedat. And are you ready for the next frame? Dr. Deedat, you're on.
Yes. So we heard a lot about from Dr. Hadih about the kinship system in African families and the fact that African and Caribbeans, when we talk about kinship, it is very central in the cultural fabric, right? Now we have to also
Dr. Deedat, I just want them to go to the next slide, Ro.
The next slide, yes.
Okay, thank you.
So now we want to look at how the kinship system in the United States look like, right? And it is very tied to the child welfare system here. Many of the kinship care arrangements in the US actually do not involve the child welfare system, but within the child welfare system itself, which I have about 10 years direct practice in, kinship care was one of the priorities. It continues to be one of the priorities. Even though child welfare systems will not get involved in African and Caribbean families unless there is child abuse or child neglect or child maltreatment involved in that sense, then the child welfare system and the court system will become involved. So here we are looking at African and Caribbean families in the context that they can have kinship care without the involvement of the child welfare system, or the child welfare system may become involved in these families at some point due to child abuse or child neglect. But why is the child welfare system in the United States even prioritize or take into account the fact that kinship care is good? It is a good practice. It is a good form of placement or a good form of alternative care. The reason is that, one, there's minimized trauma. When children are placed with family member or with a kin, they're able to stay with their family without going through the foster care system, which sometimes can lead to children falling through the cracks. And the fact that they are being removed probably from their community to another community is traumatizing in the first place. So when children are able to stay with their families or their kin or even neighbors whom they are used to, whom they know, that minimizes the trauma. Also, preservation of cultural identity. When children are staying or they stay with a kin, they're able to keep the language, keep their preferences, cultural values, and etc. Right? So the identity is intact if they stay with a kin or with a family. Also, there is this positive outcome of increased placement stability. If they are staying with a family, the chances or the probability that they will be bouncing from one home to another minimizes, it reduces, right? They reduce. So that is very helpful. And also improved behavioral outcomes. Children in foster care, there has been a lot of research, and I personally did my dissertation, my PhD dissertation on foster care placement stability, and it is very it was, and research has proven that children in foster care, many of those with behavior issues, are more likely to disrupt their placements. Here in kinship care, if children are with their families know them, right? The family knows them. They really know the child right from infancy, and they know how to better intervene if a child is having behavior problems, tantrums, etc. Compared to if a child is with a whole stranger, like foster parent or another alternative placement. So these are some of the benefits that the child welfare system in the US look at and make them want to continue to emphasize the need to promote kinship care. It is very helpful to know that. Now, we conducted a research to look at the dynamics between the US child welfare system and Blacks, and the kinship care. It wasn't specifically on kinship care, but through the research, looking at that.
Next slide, excuse me.
Can you hear me? Yes, I'll go to that, but I wanted to introduce that first. So yeah, so that research was focused on Blacks and the child welfare system. And it was interesting to find certain things, right? And before I get there, this is some background information that Blacks are overrepresented in the child welfare system. This is supported by numerous research. And there are many reasons why Blacks are overrepresented in the system. These are poverty, racial discrimination, lack of formal and informal support, child welfare worker bias, right? So even the workers themselves being biased, and some of them, the bias stem from racial discrimination, etc., right? And Black immigrants, so this is generally Black people or Black children and families in the child welfare system. Now, because of the intersectionality, Black immigrants, because of language barriers and other factors that we are going to be looking at very soon, they are even at a higher risk of becoming entangled with the child welfare system. And we are going to be looking at that very soon and how that connects to the kinship care system. So next slide. So this research was a qualitative research. We conducted interviews with Sub-Saharan Africans or Black African immigrants. We wanted to gain their perspectives on the child welfare system and how that impacts their family stability, the family preservation, etc. And I was lucky to conduct this research with a fellow professor at Westchester, Dr. Baba, and also a research assistant, Faye. Yeah, he's not here today, but he was very helpful. His name is Papa Faye, but he's not here yet. This study is in the works. It's going to be published this spring. So when it becomes available, I'll share it with this great network that will become available to all of you. But let's look at the research itself. Next slide. So we interviewed 15 participants, 7 females and 8 males across Pennsylvania and Delaware. And all participants had lived in the US for at least 5 years. And they came from different parts of sub-Saharan Africa, Ghana, Kenya, Nigeria, and Sierra Leone, Ivory Coast, and Senegal as well. So we interviewed these participants, we analyzed the data, and here are the findings. Next slide. So we found 2 broad themes, right? Protective factors and risk factors. And why are these very important to look at? Because kinship care is part of the African cultural fabric. So if we found, we were able to find some, factors that actually strike against the kinship care system in the US, like how Africans are able to maintain their families or keep children within their families. That was very interesting. And we are going to look at those risk and risk factors to be specific. Can we go to the next slide? So we found numerous, like 6 major sub-themes or risk factors that impact African, immigrants or sub-Saharan African immigrants, their relationship with the child welfare system. And as you can see here, one of the major findings was the cultural clash. So if you go clockwise, I would say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The 5th, sub-theme, the cultural clash, was one of the main sub-themes or one of the main findings of this study that described how sub-Saharan Africans or Black immigrants in this country struggle to reconcile their cultural values with the US child welfare system. And to reconcile means that they have their own culture, which is kinship care is very central to how they raise their children. And the US child welfare looks at kinship care in a very different way, where, you know, when the child welfare system may become involved and it will decide for you who might even qualify as a kin, and all the other barriers, including, you know, doing background checks in some cases, and also many other, you know, and you know, discrimination, pure racial discrimination. All these factors affected how these families can keep their culture, with the kinship care being a central part of it. So let's go to the next slide, and I will talk a little more about it. The protective factors, these are some, you know, other factors that, you know, guarded or protected African immigrants from going to the child welfare or from interacting with the child welfare system. But I would like to quickly go to the next slide and see how, you know, what we can do, like what are the implications of this research to kinship care. So what I mentioned earlier was that, you know, African immigrants, they have the culture, and the culture, kinship care, keeping their children with them or with another family is just central. When you go to Ghana, you know, I was personally raised by my aunt, right? From the age of 6 until age 15, I was living with my aunt full time. She raised me without any problems. She raised me. My mother didn't even think twice, giving me to my aunt to raise me, and it happens all the time. My mom also raised her nephews and nieces, etc. And it is very common in our culture. Now, when we bring it here, and we have a system that wants to ask questions, why and how are you going to take your nephew and raise your nephew? There are many, you know, processes and bureaucracies that individuals have to go through, families have to go through, and that serves as, I would say, that serves as a barrier to kinship care system here. So here are some of the things we can do when we have African and Caribbean families come to the US, and what they can do to keep that kinship care system going for them. One, the partnership with community organizations to connect Black immigrants to income generating opportunities. What we saw earlier was poverty, right? One of the factors of why Blacks are overrepresented in the child welfare system. And then the fact that the kinship care system become diluted for Blacks or African and Caribbean family is poverty. So what do we need to do? We have to create income generating opportunities for these immigrants when they come in. They'll be able to keep their families together, and separation will be less or will be minimized to a greater degree. Also, we need to sensitize Black immigrants on child abuse and neglect laws, policies, and practices. One thing we saw was the cultural clash, right? And the fact that the culture or the child welfare systems in Africa and maybe Caribbean, they are not that you know, stringent. They are not that effective, and they are not so westernized compared to the US, right? In Africa, in Caribbean, that African culture of, okay, we can settle this out of, you know, the court, we can handle these family issues without going to the court, that is there, right? But when they come here, they need to be sensitized, they need to be educated on the policies, the laws, the practices of the child welfare system, so they don't lose their children to the child welfare system, instead of, you know, maybe having a kin or a family member, a neighbor take care of their children. We also need to integrate Black community networks into the child welfare framework. There are many, like AFRICOM, for example, is one of them. We need to be involved. They need to collaborate with child welfare systems, where instead of children of African descent or Caribbean descent going to child welfare system, these community networks can help, you know, intervene and make sure the child is kept with a family. Also, we need to educate newly arrived, you know, Black immigrants from Caribbean and from Africa on the resources available to them. Many of them come, they don't know what to do, they don't know where to go for help, they don't know where to go and apply for food stamp, for WIC, for CCIS or child welfare services. They don't know where to go. And all this can impact how they're able to keep their family together or be able to keep that kinship together instead of losing the child to the child welfare system. And finally, there is a great need. I mean, my background is in child welfare. I've practiced child welfare. I've done a lot of research in child welfare. I currently teach child welfare classes or courses at Westchester University. But one thing I think is very important is to have a very interdisciplinary approach. So we are not only looking at the child welfare system as, just focus on the child. There has to be some holistic approach. We can have folks from mental health, folks from public health, and other fields, right, come together to work as a team to make sure that they are addressing everything that impacts the African, the Caribbean, that family and their children, to keep the family going, so that we are looking at the holistic, the whole being, from biological, psychological, social, and spiritual context, right? So we need to be able to bring all these folks together as a team and work to the benefit of African and Caribbean immigrants. Next slide. And here's a great reading. This was actually suggested by Dr. Anita Rogers, who is the moderator here. She has this book, she shared it with us, and she thought it would be very helpful to share with everybody today, because there are tons of resources in this book to help you with your practice, to help you with your understanding of those of African and Caribbean ancestry or origin, and how to better serve these populations. And at this point, I think I don't know, next slide. The citations, the resources. Dr. Anita Rogers, I'll pause here and hand over to you.
So there was a question, and you'll get all these slides and you'll get all these references. This is, and within that book on working with families of African Caribbean origins, there's a YouTube video of the woman who wrote the book that would be great for professional development for you guys, and all these other suggested readings. But there was a question, I don't know if Dr. Deedat or Dr. Edie, it says, what is the race classification for North Africans? That was a question, real quickly. Anybody? Dr.
I can answer that. Yeah, they are classified as Caucasians. So on the U.S. Census Bureau, North Africans, we are talking about Egyptians, Moroccans, Libyans, Algerians. They are considered as Caucasians. Yeah, so that is what the U.S. Census Bureau, they are not classified as Blacks.
Okay, and there were a couple of comments that I thought were interesting. One person said the child welfare system has not embraced or sensitive. The formal child welfare system, in all caps, isn't very inclusive of relatives and grandparents and kinship care families that are not within the system. In other words, if they're not within the system, they don't get the services. There was another comment that said one of their biggest resources or one of their biggest barriers is to getting funding for this particular group of African American to deliver the services, because often they are considered outside of, quote, the mainstream. If there are any other questions, please enter them really quickly in the chat. This was like a lot of information, a lot of good information that you could use for practice. You could also use it as you develop proposals. There's a question here. It says, we have an informal kinship program where I'm employed. We have services for formal and informal kinship care families. So someone says that both. But to the degree that we can begin to incorporate, and I suggest and I praise William Penn Foundation for recognizing to support this particular community by giving them grants, because that community, that agency is also trying to grapple with what does it mean for them to develop a kinship care support system, because they have never done that before, because everything is integrated as a whole family. Dr. Deedat, any final comments?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I agree with the fact, one of someone said, made a comment that the U.S. child welfare system itself is not very embracing of kinship care, right? Except for the formal part. The formal kinship care is the one where the child welfare system becomes involved and the court system becomes involved. That's when the child welfare system actually becomes actively involved, which is unfortunately. So that speaks to the secondary, or let me say the reactionary approach of the child welfare system instead of the primary, prevention focus, they can engage these communities, these populations, to ensure that they don't even end up in the child welfare system. But the U.S. child welfare system, unfortunately, is more reactionary in nature. They wait for something to happen before they get involved. And so I completely agree with that comment.
Any other questions anybody want to ask? I did have one question. One of the groups I worked with in Philadelphia was in Southwest Philadelphia, and we worked a lot with the Jamaican community, and that particular community was adverse, at least at that time, to mental health services, because there's a cultural norm that you keep that kind of stuff. If you're having a problem, you don't share, because either Dr. Edie or Dr. Deedat, you want to say some information on that, about that? Because that's a real big issue.
Yes, it is a big issue, and I want to commend in Philadelphia, as you said, the Department of Behavioral Health, who now has, a section dealing with immigrant communities that then chaired by an immigrant person who definitely understand. And there have been a lot of initiatives to incorporate the understanding of the trauma of intellectual disabilities and of mental health when it comes to immigrant communities. Having said that, the comment is true, is great. Automatically looking at the child who is misbehaving, for instance, or a person, right, per se, as a person having a mental issue, this terminology itself, right, has raised a lot of flags within that community. However, there have been, additional strategies. When we conducted the focus groups about in 2019, right, with 6 different, groups among the Liberians, the immigrants from Mali, Jamaicans, and all that, we clearly identified, some patterns that create what we call, mental health. We talk about, isolation. We talked about, some women, relying on, what you call it, over sexual, activities, prostitution, all of those things, by way of some of the factors that Dr. Deedat, identified. Then we also talked about, another factor, which is substance abuse, which is also rampant in these communities that we serve. And the question of suicide. In Philadelphia, we have worked with community organizations that identified last year and the year before about 5 adolescent and young adults who committed suicide. So these are the things that exist. Same thing with clear correlation with domestic violence, and they are being addressed in a way that does not frighten those communities, not necessarily under the big cap of mental health.
I wanted to, there was a comment about, that spoke to, it says, what about the need to culturally tailor interventions such as behavioral health training programs? Would speak to what kind of language, if we're going to incorporate people to get services, we have to pick the right language. There was another comment that said the Native community has a lot of experience addressing these issues. And there was another comment that said, we had trouble helping these families, because they lack the required documentation to be able to secure the benefits that they need for Social Security. Dr. Deedat, just real quickly, because we're going to have to close soon. So it's about the lack of documentation. How could that be facilitated?
Yeah, so
well, maybe, okay, Dr. Deedat, go ahead.
Go ahead, Dr. Eddy. Go ahead. That's your,
I wanted to share some of the practices that we have based on the experience that we have. Earlier, I talked about the mixed status family. Maybe the head of that household, the mother or the father of that immigrant family, may not have access by way of their documentation, by way of them being unauthorized or undocumented immigrants. However, some of their children are born or were born in the United States, and those ones, were qualified. Maybe you want to explore those ways as well. And then the other thing that we have done, especially in the midst of COVID-19, was to advocate at the either city, state, or federal level for immigrant families, regardless of their status, to be also included in some of the benefit packages, because it is about the stability of the family and the welfare or wellness of the community that we serve in general. So these are some of the avenues that what I can see in there. In terms of helping those families, also in terms of a language, well, it is clear linguistic competency have to be part of training, have to be part of the organization and the institution that you work with to be able to do that. However, let's be clear, there are we are dealing with so many languages. The reason why there are efforts in different cities to help immigrants learn basics in English. But here's another good thing that you should know. In some families that we have dealt with, the children themselves become the first line of interpretation for their parents and translators for the parents. And it has worked. So immigrant families are very resourceful, very resilient. If they do not understand anything, reach out to any community-based organizations or immigrant-led agencies that have that linguistic competency to help you address the needs of those families.
I thank Dr. Edie. I thank Dr. Deedat. That was like so much information that it's hard to consume it all in 1 hour and a half, but hopefully you'll be able to bring it up and use it for professional development, for program design, for outreach, and for collaboration with others from that community. And I turn it back over to Anna.
Thank you so much for joining us and for facilitating this conversation, Dr. Rogers. Really appreciate the three of you. As you'll see, we put a link in the chat to complete a survey about today's webinar. And I hope you all will sign up for our newsletter so that you hear about our upcoming webinars. The next one will be Dr. Terry Cross, the founding executive director of the National Indian Child Welfare Association, talking to us next month. So thank you all again, presenters, and thank you all for joining us. Goodbye.
Okay.